you can see the troubles that all governments all over the world are having at the moment. There is so much deep incoherence to our politics that creating a viable, sustainable, long-term, coherent view of your country, of your economy, is very difficult, and they keep breaking down.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. This week's episode is about Alberta politics, and while there are some times that we get into the weeds, so to speak, I think that this episode remains relevant and poignant, whether you live somewhere else or if you're listening to this podcast years into the future. We talk about the 2019 provincial election and the aftermath of that, but within that we talk about what is underneath a vote. We talk about populism, the coming together of economy and environment, the difference between being good at governing and bad at campaigning, or vice versa. The communications problem of politics, what can government do in a downturn, and what elected officials always do when the economy is in recession, when they have no choice but to beat the drums of recovery. Federalism, what Albertans value. And the question, could we change to the metric system today in 2019? We did it before, but is the environment, is the landscape right for that kind of seismic shift in our thinking, in the way that we perceive the world, and mandated by government? We also talk about the importance of this concept of trust in the political discourse and how it is, as Denise Brunsdon speaks of, the sustenance of liberal democracy. Denise Brunsdon is one of our guests. She's a lawyer and former politico. We've also got analyst and pollster Janet Brown and University of Calgary political science professor and alumnus of this podcast, Anthony Sayers. Now, if you like this show, I just wanted to remind you to please give it a rating on iTunes or Facebook or whatever podcast app that you use, and please go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to find all previous episodes and to get in touch with me, to give me your feedback on this episode or any other, and to give me your suggestions for future guests or future topics to discuss on this show. Again, that is whatonearthisgoingon.ca. All right, Denise, Janet, and Anthony, welcome to the program.
Thanks. You.
I'm excited to have you guys here. I'm going to go one by one, if that's okay, and have you introduce yourself briefly. So, Denise, tell us a bit about yourself and where you come from.
I am born in Lethbridge, Alberta, but I grew up in BC, and I've lived in Ontario and Quebec for about half of my life, but I've been back in Alberta for 5 or so years now. I am a lawyer here right now in Calgary, but I used to be in public opinion research, and before that I did work in politics in Ottawa.
Great. And Denise, I've asked you to be here kind of as our insider voice. You've been an insider in politics before, and that's an interesting perspective that we don't often hear from a lot. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Janet.
I'm Janet Brown. I'm a pollster. I have been living in Alberta since 2000 for quite some time. I came from Ontario, but even for about 7 years before I moved here, my focus was mainly on Alberta politics and traveling back and forth and doing a lot of work here. So I'm a pollster, and in particular, I write this quarterly newsletter called The Wild Ride that looks at Alberta politics. So that's sort of how I stay current on what I think is happening in Alberta politics.
Yeah, and I think I see you as an evidence-based analyst too, not just a pollster, but someone who's looking at the data to give us a perspective on, again, what's beneath the headlines, what's happening underneath the bigger picture that we see on the front page of the news. You provide that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, obviously when elections happen, we get tested on how well we can predict the vote. But one of the reasons that a pollster is able to make a good prediction on vote is because they know what's underlying the vote. And, you've got to be able to look at your numbers and know intuitively whether they're right or they're wrong or not. And what happens during election campaigns is people show up from other jurisdictions, they do some sort of cheap and dirty poll, and they just say, there's the numbers. And then everyone who lives in Alberta goes, yeah, that couldn't possibly be right.
Right. It's interesting because often we're looking at politics, we're missing the data because we get so carried away with the jargon and the messaging that comes from politicians. And we do see articles by pollsters saying, well, this is what we think is going to happen. But what's really interesting to me is when they tell me, well, this is what Alberta is really like, for example, or this is what Canada is really like. And we can't argue with the data that suggests that Alberta or Albertans think in a certain way and are, by evidence, are shown to think in a certain way.
Well, and if you understand the values that sort of underlie people's opinions, then you'll know whether the polling numbers are intuitively right or intuitively wrong. But yeah, like you said, if you just come in and sort of say we measured people, and the people that were easy for us to reach told us this, and and there you go. And we have had several elections in a row here in Alberta where the polls were drastically wrong, and for a whole number of reasons, I think that serves voters very poorly. Because I do think people pay attention to the polls. I think it impacts how they're going to vote, and they make different decisions based on whether they think it's a close race or not a close race. And so if the media's going to report on polls, I think it sort of behooves them to make sure they're reporting on methodologically sound polling.
Anthony Sayers, you're a professor here at the university, and I just wanted to have full disclosure. I took a couple of your courses, and we've been in touch over the many years.
No harm was done, which is good to know.
Well, you don't know that.
Well, okay, you're right. I don't really know that, but I hope no harm was done.
No harm was done.
So I teach political science here at the University of Calgary. I write on Alberta and Canadian politics, in particular elections, and parties and elections. I've been in Alberta for 20 years, not part of my life plan originally, but there you go. These things happen, right? You marry someone, you end up in a place you hadn't expected. So it's been an interesting ride. It's a very unusual place politically. I think in some ways it's, as when you come here as an outsider, you can't help but notice this is a very unusual one-party, well, for most of the years I've been here, one-party dominant state. But for a political scientist, of course, that's fascinating, because one-party democratic, one-party dominant states are pretty rare, and there's lots to be known. So really, in some ways, my career has mapped onto trying to figure out how things like one-party dominance work, how notions like populism, which now, of course, is everywhere, but which has been part of Alberta political culture on both the left and the right for 100 years, how that actually operates in real life. So some of that stuff is just fascinating, and there's lots to be learned from studying Alberta if you want to understand some of these other things that have happened in the world.
What's interesting about your work, Anthony, that I found is similar to, when I lived in other countries or other cities. I lived in London, England for a while, and I visited that city every day that I lived there. I went to museums, I went to art galleries, I did things that Londoners never do and never did. And therefore, I wouldn't say I understood their city better than they did, but I understood things about their city that they couldn't see. And partly that's coming from Australia, giving you a really interesting outsider perspective. But now after 20 years, you get to see things that reveal what we're really like in Alberta, or will reveal what Canadians really do against the grain of our expectations. One of the things that you've talked about before is that Albertans are actually quite progressive, but they often vote conservative because that's the anti-Ottawa, anti-liberal vote, that's right? Yeah. And I've always found that fascinating about your work.
Yeah, and I mean, Albertans are stuck with a problem. Everybody is, right? The peculiar Alberta problem is, even if you're, for example, quite worried about the environment, you have to be aware that the environment and the economy come together in a particular way in Alberta. And that involves oil and gas extraction. Irrelevant of whether you think that's good or bad, that's the gift that we have. And so once you've got to say, well, where do I draw that line? Well, in my own personal life, if your employment relies on the oil and gas industry, you will have to make a different calculation than somebody who's not employed in oil and gas in Alberta, but also in another province. So your calculations about what counts and how you balance conservative, economic, or development sort of questions against environment questions will be peculiar to you and your circumstance. And that's something that Canadians don't always give each other credit for. That you can be an environmentalist in Alberta, but also be aware that it employs people and puts food on the table. So that if you're worried about other Albertans, you have a sort of particular duty of care to your fellow citizens that changes you and changes your politics.
Denise Brunsdon, you and I have known each other for a few years now. And one thing that I've always loved about you is that you have a way of being, you were a liberal for a long time, maybe still are, I don't know, that's a question for you. But you were a party loyalist, party supporter, but at never one time did I ever experience a conversation with you where I thought you weren't thinking freely. and thinking for yourself. And that isn't something I always found. I worked in Ottawa for the government of Canada on the political side for a couple of years, and found that most people on the party side, they could think for themselves, certainly, but they wouldn't show that. They wouldn't allow you in. And I think it's a breath of fresh air. It's certainly dangerous. It's certainly not going to make everyone's career to be free thinking. But you're going to get the first question, Denise. So what on earth is going on?
So there are two, I think, answers to that very important question, which is my favorite part about this podcast, because everybody goes on knowing what the question will be, and I think it's still surprising and hard to answer.
And sometimes they're surprised, too, by their own answer.
Yeah. On the one hand, the recent election is not surprising and very natural. To your point, Anthony, it has been primarily a one-party state. It was a disjointed conservative movement in the last election. And so two conservative parties, and then when they reunite, chances are it would go back to the same one-party state. That said, there is a very peculiar outcome, to my mind, as someone who's been in politics, both on campaign side as well as on government side, which is normally political parties are very good at campaigning and not always so good at governing. The New Democrats, to my mind, and I will disclose that I do think I have a bias. When you're a federal Liberal, you have a bit of a question mark when you move to Alberta. You'll find some join the New Democrats, some do join the have joined the United Conservative. Some go in the Alberta Party, some go in the provincial Liberal Party. So, we do spread around. That said, I have been traditionally center left in who I've worked for. So I worked for Christy Clark and Paul Martin and Stéphane Dion and Kent Hare, which is, as well, Ben. But that's my bias. But I do think that it would be hard for an objective politico to look at the New Democrat government and not say, for a first-time government, they did such a good job. Scandal-free, not heavily partisan, not obviously driven by a very strong agenda, but very focused on the practicals of government. And so it was very unique, I think, watching a first-time government do such a good job, and then come election time, maybe not such a good job on the campaign front, not as strong campaigning. And that's usually what you find in political party DNAs. Great campaigners, sometimes especially when they haven't been in power for a long time, a little bit of mishaps there. And the New Democrats really fluidly took government and I think worked it quite well. And so it was sad for me just to see a group of people who I think did try quite hard and did try their very best for the government, not really to be able to turn that same skill set back to the more partisan cut and thrust side.
Well, and it's interesting because back in 2015 when the NDP won in the Orange Crush election, the change election of 2015, most people thought these are a bunch of kids who didn't expect to be elected. People who have no experience in politics or government, they're going to fall on their faces and fail miserably. And you're saying that that's absolutely not what happened, quite against the expectation of 2015.
It is just so complex. Government, even municipal, but provincially, federally, it's so complex, and it like any new job, it takes years to get your feet wet, to learn how to work with the bureaucracy and understand, how to consult, how to have priorities, what to make those tough choices, to actually implement. I mean, it's a million moving pieces, and then you've also got a lot of new and rookie MLAs in this situation who didn't expect to be elected. Keeping them in line is a full-time job, and they did it. They did it so well, and I think, looking by comparison to other newer governments, certainly the Ford one would be one.
If I can jump in, I think before this is lost in the mists of time, in some ways, Rachel Notley was the key. She is one of the most extraordinary politicians I've met. I've interviewed maybe getting to the thousands, certainly the hundreds of politicians now. And I just happened to be in the legislature the first year she was elected and watched her explain to the speaker who had written standing orders how they should operate. She was a very gifted politician. with a very good touch for handling people, but also a sensible sort of view of policy. And so much of what you say, I think, came down to the leadership was commonsensical, basically, well-informed, deep roots in Alberta, so understood sort of Alberta norms and forms. And I think she got it largely right. The other thing that came along with that was careful management of the rookies, so that there weren't, and I think amongst the rookies themselves, an acceptance that they needed to be sort of guided through.
So what does that mean? Like, from an outsider perspective, what does it mean to have MLAs, who we think of as the bosses, being guided or managed? Is that just Rachel Notley telling them what to do? What does that mean?
No, well, I think if there were mistakes, it was early on. The first couple of years, things were not as good, and that was because the standard operating procedure for most people is to get people in your party from elsewhere that have had government experience, which is great. They know how government works, but some of those people, even though some had roots in Alberta, really didn't bring in a sort of commonsensical view of Alberta to policy. So there was a combination of Notley knowing that she needed to, I think, and the leadership knowing that they needed to explain to the rookies, and then they hired people from outside, and some of that went astray, I think. But by and large, you need two. You need rookies that are willing to learn and be told, and you need leadership willing to understand that. And that doesn't always happen, right? You get rookies who've, well, now I've won something, I can do stuff, right? Well, yeah, maybe.
As Denise said, it's complicated.
Yeah. And leadership who'd think it's just about the leaders and the rookies are you can know.
I guess as a pollster, I have a totally different yardstick for what makes for a successful government. You know, the NDP government came in, and they were elected at a time where people were getting very frustrated with the traditional governing Progressive Conservative Party, and I think Albertans wanted to teach the Conservatives a lesson in 2012, and then they sort of chickened out, and then they decided in 2015 they weren't going to chicken out. They were going to teach the PCs a lesson, and the electoral victory of the NDP had more to do with that than anything that the NDP did right during the election. And immediately after taking office, the economy started to falter. And Rachel Notley and the NDP were completely tone deaf to the concerns of Albertans throughout their administration. So, you know, to say they were a successful government when they just, right from the start, made themselves completely unre-electable is not my measure of a successful government. You know, and it just, and I'm not one of these people who buys into the notion of, well, they were kind of an accidental government and then the economy failed and, like, you know, how could you expect them to get re-elected again? I think there was a path to victory for them, but they just never seized upon that. They just ignored the changing economic time, denied the frustration and the anxiety that Albertans were going through. And I think it was an obvious place for the NDP to position themselves as the government that was going to protect the vulnerable, the government that was going to protect the people who were being hit hardest from the economic downturn. And instead, for 3 years, all we got from the NDP was, well, what economic downturn? Anytime somebody would talk about unemployment numbers, people would say, well, employment numbers are good. So if you don't have a job, well, that's probably your fault. Anytime people expressed concern about Trans Mountain Pipeline, Rachel Notley would scoff and say, well, it's going to be built. So I just see it as 3 years of being tone deaf. And once the UCP was created, the die was cast. The NDP were going to be sort of down in the 30% level, and the UCP was going to be in the 50% level. And I've spent the last 3 years being incredibly frustrated, you know, at how out of step the NDP have been with the values and perceptions of Albertans.
So, Janet, was this a case of the NDP's policies not being aligned? I mean, here's my question. Was the NDP simply tone deaf and didn't get it and thought, we'll figure this out in the end and Albertans will come around to realize that things aren't so bad? Or did they recognize that things were bad, but their policy approach was just simply not in line with what people wanted?
Well, I think there were some missteps on policy, but for the most part, I think it was a communications problem. For the most part, I think it was, as I said, every time my MLA is Joe Ceci, who was the finance minister, and I used to get emails from him all the time as a constituent, and like in the subject line, it would say things like, "Recession is in the rearview mirror." The vast majority of Albertans don't think that. And I would just sort of smack my head and think, like, what are they thinking? Like, what like, how like, how can you just sort of deny what Albertans are concerned about and be surprised that you're going to lose the next election?
Right.
I think that's right. I would have thought that the first 2 years there was a lot of that. And I mean, I think of them as a good government in terms of not making mistakes, and I think being practical. In terms of things like spending and getting some of that right, I agree there were errors in that I don't think pitch it quite correctly. It's also true that there's a sort of Calgary element to this. If you're in Edmonton, the NDP's things are not so bad made more sense because employment was 2 or 3% lower than it is in Calgary. Unemployment, was 2 or 3% lower. So you could sort of buy it. And there may have been some tone deafness to Calgary in that unemployment here is the highest it's been, I think, pretty much ever, certainly for many, many decades. And there was certainly, I think, a lack of sensitivity to the differences between Edmonton and Calgary that played into policy missteps. And there was mistakes in terms of rural versus urban. That they're every party has this problem that you don't know what you don't know. Sounds Runfeldian, but they were insensitive to the countryside.
And the NDP won Edmonton. They had a margin of 9%, a margin of victory of 9%. They won almost all of the seats. But from the very beginning, it looked like Rachel Notley was running to be Premier of Edmonton.
There's some truth to that. I'm a bit more generous to it maybe, but I think there is a tone deafness, and that can happen to any party. That again, think about the unusualness of this, that you have two cities of equal size, and that's pretty much, this is about, of the major economies and large provinces, this is the only place where that's true. And so one of the fascinating dynamics of Alberta politics is how you play the big cities and then the big cities versus the countryside. That's a constant and unusual sort of dynamic that you have to get right. And if you look at the PCs, there was an attempt to, rather like Quebec, to cycle between a Calgary leader and an Edmonton leader as a way of dealing with that, as at the federal level do, French and English speaking.
Well, those of us who operate in Alberta politics, we always there's three legs to the stool in Alberta politics. There's Calgary, there's Edmonton, and there's the rest of the province. Yeah. And it's just sort of very well known in Alberta politics, you must capture two out of the three legs of the stool, and you have to run for at least two of them.
That's right.
And the UCP won two of them and formed a large majority.
And so no strategy from the NDP. Right, they blew up the country thing early on, and they actually recovered on that, but not enough. And they didn't figure that out to say, well, we need one other besides Edmonton. They never quite figured out how to do that. I think that's true.
So, Denise, we're talking a lot about communications now, and not just the approach of policy, but how it's being communicated to people. I really like your point, Janet, about how you get this email, which is just cognitive dissonance, right?
That's a good word.
But maybe the NDP was hoping that they would convince people that the recession is in the rearview mirror because, well, our statistics show that this is true. Maybe Albertans will be convinced of this. So, Denise, having worked in the game for so long, is there anything that the NDP could have done differently in their practical approach here?
I think that you mentioned populism earlier, and certainly what Albertans think about the economy. The last few months and probably years, I think, it's been raised for me the big question about what is a recession. As someone with an economics degree, there are factors, statistical ones, that are traditionally used to measure what a recession is. And I think that a party in government, when there's an economic downturn, has a really tough job because you can't. What might come off as being tone deaf, I would say, is pretty much their only option, which is to paint this as turned around or turning around. And it's very hard to be in government and say, yes, we're in a recession. Things are getting real bad. Buckle in. That's not going to work either for them. So I think they did what they had to, which is go with the science, go with the stats. It did not reflect the way people felt whatsoever. And ultimately, voters are the ones who get to decide.
Can I just ask if there was another option? Could they have simply, the recession's still going, but blame someone else for it? Blame the federal government, blame the price of oil or something? Would that have been effective?
I think they did.
The real problem is that it is just a hiding to nothing to say we're not in control, because you say, well, if you're not in control, you can't fix it either. Right? All over the world, that's one of those most difficult strategies to run for a government. If you blame somebody else, then you better have a way of saying, well, but we can fix that by excluding that effect or that government or like Kenney. That's Kenney's role. We're going to take the federal government out of Alberta, sort of. More Alberta, less federal government, right? That's basically one of the stories here. And he may have some luck in doing that, but really he needs luck as well, because he can't do actually very much. He needs a bit of luck.
So his platform in the next election is already written. We've recovered. Whether or not that's true, that has to be what he says.
And it's ours. Alberta is ours. We own more of it. We're running more of it. We're in charge. That sort of stuff. We're back in charge. We're open for business. All that stuff. So I think it's hard to make a winning strategy out of they're to blame. It's because it wonders, well, why do we care then? If all the power's with them, what's the point of electing you? But there is something around the election which I do think is very important, and that is that chasing Jason Kenney was, as the main strategy, was a relatively high risk strategy. It could have been easily balanced against hope and vision. I'm a great believer that if I look at the elections in my life, where there's the successful elections nearly always have some hope and vision moment. And the NDP, which is, you would think, a party that could offer that sort of thing, offered nearly none of it. It was all, Jason Kenney's a bad person or whatever, bad thing, we mustn't vote. Instead of saying, Jason Kenney, we don't know about him. However, we're invested in the dreams and hopes of Albertans. There was none of that. And I think that was a major misstep in the election, not to figure out a more positive way of talking to Albertans.
Janet, is this borne out in the data?
Yes, it is borne out in the data. I mean, it's just sort of psychology 101. If you don't acknowledge the validity of my anxiety, I'm never going to trust you to have the solutions to find the solutions for my anxiety. And so the idea that, the government had no choice but to deny that there was, an economic crisis going on in Alberta, I don't agree with that as well. I mean, I think campaigns that win are the campaigns that match the public mood. I say to clients all the time, you don't have enough money to change anybody's mind. All you can do is figure out what people are thinking and then align yourself with that. So in the middle of the campaign, I did a poll, and the poll turned out to be pretty good. It was accurate. It was the only poll that was accurate to within the margin of error for all the political parties. And in that poll, we asked people what their top concerns were. And, Jason Kenney stood at a podium throughout the whole campaign that said, economy, jobs, pipelines, because those were the top three concerns. And in fact, 2/3 of Albertans named one of those three things as their single biggest concern. 2/3 of Albertans. And, Jason Kenney is not a nice guy, didn't register at all, as a concern for Albertans. So that's what Albertans were concerned about. That's what the election was about. That's what the voters wanted the election to be about. And wishing that away was just never a smart electoral strategy.
So what could they have done differently?
I think they had to acknowledge people's economic concerns, and they had to reach out to people and say, we have better solutions. We will do more to protect your family than they will. We will do more to protect your job than they will. I mean, you think about the NDP and their alliance with unions, and I think they could have been the party of jobs and good jobs. And instead, they decided to be the party of moral self-righteousness. And that just doesn't play well in Alberta.
An insight so far in this conversation that I really appreciated is the idea that Jason Kenney's successful campaign in the 2019 election could have been balanced, perhaps successfully, by a campaign of hope and vision from the NDP. We often talk about politics being overly negative, but when all parties go negative, there seems to be room for a bright light of positivity and vision. I don't know if it would have worked, but it seems like that was lacking, and it seems like it is lacking quite often in politics and in elections all over the world. Now, coming up in this conversation, we continue to talk about the Alberta election. We talk about trustworthiness. We talk about what Albertans seem to value and what the data says about what they value. And we talk about this interesting concept that Anthony brings up about coherency in electoral platforms, and that incoherence is an aspect that we can't deny in modern politics. That's all coming up in this episode of What on Earth is Going On. And just a question for the group. A lot of people say that in the 2015 election, the NDP won because they were not the PCs. And they were also Rachel Notley, who was a charismatic and very powerful leader. But once people recognized what had happened, they went, NDP. I'm not sure if I wanted that. That's the argument about 2015. And that many people then said, there's no chance they're going to win in 2019. It's impossible. I remember those conversations 4 years ago. But of course, they had their second best showing ever in the recent election. They got, I can't remember how much of the percentage of the vote they got, and then 33%. Which for a regular NDP regular election, that's quite good. But my question is that I'm wondering about this brand of the NDP, right? Everyone recognizes this as a national party, and the NDP provincially is not separate from the NDP federally, which I know, Anthony, you talk a lot about, that Canada has this very interesting context where we have separate parties from the provincial stage from the federal one, but the NDP is not separate. They're the same thing, which can be an Achilles heel for them. And I just wonder, my first question is, how much does branding of the NDP fit into this? But second of all, what would have happened, this is maybe a counterfactual, well, it is a counterfactual, but what would have happened if they had, say, declared independence and made up a new party 2-3 years ago, when they recognized that the federal NDP was going with the LEAP manifesto, for example? Just throw it out there. Denise.
I promised myself I wasn't going to talk about the waffle. You made a really good point about one of the things that we're hoping to do with this podcast in particular is make it relevant, not just today, not just in the rearview mirror instantly following an election, but broad strokes.
And that someone a year from now can listen to this and get something out of it.
That's right. And looking at the big picture of Canadian politics provincially and federally over the last, I've been heavily involved for about 18 years, so I feel comfortable saying in the last 20 years, it has been a good story for the New Democrats, federally and provincially. They are doing well. And I think their fortunes are going to continue to do well. And so whether or not they want to break apart provincially and federally, I find it more not crucial for them to decide. I don't think it's going to dictate necessarily a huge amount of success or failure, because they're all sort of part of that center and quite left and more left movement. Especially when you look at the way that that urban centers are breaking in Canada. I think the overall left movement is doing well in Canada. There are some benefits to separating election on election, because you do have a bit more flexibility. Ultimately, though, their campaigners have been getting stronger, faster, smarter. They're learning. One of the things that they're well known for, and I admire immensely, is the way that they share resources, federal to provincial, when times are tough or when there's real good fights that need to be fought. They coalesce and they share their top talent. And so, that would be why Brian Topp was the chief of staff, or one of the reasons Brian Topp would have been the chief of staff for Rachel Notley at the beginning. And that's an incredible model. I don't know that would change if they separated logistically, but I think just generally the left is saleable, especially with the upcoming groups of voters that are about to hit 18. I think they've got a good place in the big picture.
And specifically, you'd say that the NDP brand is saleable in Alberta in forthcoming elections.
I do.
They can win two of the three stool legs, for example.
I do.
It's interesting, and the most obvious ones are two cities. Calgary is going to be a tough sell for a while. But it's interesting. Your point is well taken, that one of the things that distinguishes Canadian politics from politics nearly anywhere else is that parties run into federalism in a much more profound way here than nearly anywhere else. So in most federal countries, the party system repeats at the local level pretty much what you see at the federal level. There are variations in Australia. There's some more variations than, say, the US. Canada is very unusual to the degree that that's broken, that you find different parties, Saskatchewan Party, whatever, UCP, running here and there. So a party has to confront that, and there are lots of reasons why that has happened, and most of it has got to do with policy room, not wanting to carry the baggage of the other level, whether it be the provincial at the federal or the federal. Right. The NDP, as you move farther and farther left, parties want to be integrated because they have a sort of view of the world that says, organisation, socialism sort of, organisation, central planning, or planning at least, is a good thing. So the idea that you would break up the bits and allow variation is not really part of their philosophy. However, we did see that even for the NDP, eventually Rachel Notley had to disown the LEAP manifesto and take on the BC NDP because over the mountain. So it was a perfect encapsulation of the difficulty of trying to run an integrated party in Canada. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the federal NDP now it depends a bit. We're in flux. They're not looking very good now, but maybe the Liberal Party will be in trouble at the next federal election, and the NDP will benefit. But it looks difficult for the NDP federally at the moment. But that constant battle between how you can contain Canada within one party, even the Conservatives, who in some ways are ideologically more predisposed to have difference, mm-hmm. have collapsed. They had, the BC Conservatives were basically not a party for most of the last century. So that is a fascinating thing, and that will go on for some time. One of the last point I'll make, one of the big theories, Dick Johnson's big theory, is that is now changing. So I've got Richard Johnson at UBC's great book on the party system, if you're interested. Canadian party system argues that we're about to see the sort of coalescing of a left and a right. Big NDP, and then the real fight is on the right. Mm-hmm. Will it be a Liberal Party or a Conservative Party? Goes back to Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper tried to destroy the Liberal Party because he wanted elections being run between the Conservatives federally and the NDP. He sort of failed, but he tried. And now the big question in Ontario, will it be the Conservatives versus the NDP, or is there a role for the Liberals still in that centrist right position?
And can I just ask a question there? Mm-hmm. There's another exacerbating factor for me anyways, which is that in provincial elections are often anti-federal government elections. Right? Mm-hmm. And so then, that's just part of the ethos of it. Yeah. I've never seen a provincial election. I've seen some where it's not a part of the conversation. Never seen one where it's pro-federal government. And so then if we're looking in comparison to other countries, often the party that can go against what's happening on the grand stage gets a bigger piece of the pie. Mm-hmm.
It is actually one of the mysteries for political scientists in the country that it's very hard to show that statistically or even with very sophisticated models. You look at it, you say, well, it's obvious. Look at what's happened here. We've got the Liberal Party federally and all these Conservative. But it's actually very difficult to show that as a mechanical, mathematical effect. So it's been one of those great sort of, hidden or, unknowables that it makes intuitive sense, but it's very hard to show. But that leads us to the point about the current UCP government is at the centre of a number of growing and important things in Canada. Conservatism, environment versus economics, the future of federal-provincial relations. There's a bunch of things that this current government is going to be right at the centre of.
And populism as well.
Populism, yeah.
Janet?
I did a very extensive survey about a year ago for CBC Calgary. It was called the Road Ahead Survey, and we looked at a whole raft of social values. And long story short, we found that sort of three key themes emerged that really do a good job of sort of defining what Albertans were. So of everything we tested, the things that tested most strongly in Alberta was, number one, we don't like paying taxes. Number two, we want to live in a fair and equitable society. I mean, we give really high marks to things like gender equity and protection of minorities' rights and things like that. And the number three value we expressed the strongest was we are very suspicious of Ottawa. So, if you want to understand Alberta in a nutshell, there it is. We don't like paying taxes. We think of ourselves as fiscally conservative, but apart from not liking paying taxes, we are not fiscally conservative in any other sense. We love our social programs. We love government spending. We just don't like paying taxes. We are a very socially progressive province, but we have this huge suspicion of Ottawa, and it's almost in our DNA, right?
This dislike of taxes, is that distinct to Alberta, or is that pretty much everywhere?
Well, nobody likes paying taxes, but we just have this visceral aversion to paying taxes, right? When you ask people, remember the phrase the Alberta advantage, right? You say to people, what does that mean? It means we don't pay very much in taxes, right? And we all moved here, and the first thing, everybody comes from somewhere else, and you come here, and the very first thing you notice is how you're not paying as many taxes. Mm-hmm. You're not paying a PST, and it just gets in our DNA that taxes are bad, and so it is worse here.
the Alberta advantage, I see it as very specific. The Alberta advantage is the conceit allowed to Albertans because we have so much money coming from from oil and gas that we can say
had so much money.
We believe in low taxes. Just build another hospital with that other money. That's just that great Albertan advantage that we can have the conceit of being fiscally conservative because the money is coming from, I don't know, not us, somewhere else. So even governments in Alberta, and this was clearly true of the PC government, never had to say to people, look, we're all fiscal conservatives, right? Yeah, great. Well, we're not going to raise your taxes, but we're going to cut services because that's the only way. One government did decline, and he got away with it for, I think, very interesting reasons about that government and that period. But still, most of us don't want to have a government confront us with the question, as Mr. Prentice implied to his loss, I think, before the 2015 election, that you will have to decide. More taxes if you want the services you've got, or lower taxes if you don't want debt, and if you know what I mean. If you and the concurrent less services.
And how do you not pose that question and remain honest? Because is that not the central question of a modern market-based Western government?
Well, politicians want to get elected first, and so it's amazing how even very conservative politicians, after a time in office, the way they speak about money is quite different from when they are outside government. Once you're in government, you just don't like saying no. And if you've got a chance of not saying no, because the money is flowing in from somewhere, then you do. I've seen this with people I've known who've gone into government, that they say, yes, this is silly, we should run the economy, no deficits, no debt. And the people come, well, that's a good idea, we should pay for that. That helps people. Oh, and we don't have to raise taxes to do it. So, in fact, it's the re-election sort of thing that starts to, people want to get on with people.
I do also worry, broad strokes, looking at trends in Canadian governance, is a trend toward a very popularity-based approach, which is very important for winning, obviously, the campaigning piece, the populism piece, versus good governance. And I wrote an op-ed a few years ago called "Could we change to the metric system today?" Mm-hmm. And I think a very good question is, can Alberta implement a sales tax? Sales taxes, of course, being the preferred and by most economists being preferred because, of course, they're taxing what people choose to purchase. So if you make high-end luxury purchases, you pay more taxes than if you're buying necessities, as opposed to income taxes.
And Alberta is the only province without a PST.
That's right. So we've taken a bit of a different approach. Some would say not as good a governance approach. And looking back to how unpopular the change from imperial to metric was in Canada, it was palpable. It was very unpopular. But we did it because it was the right thing to do. I think there's the U.S. and one obscure...
Liberia. Is it Liberia?
That's right. Yeah. Liberia or Libya, they're still on. So in hindsight, it was fairly obvious, but it was still wildly unpopular. When Paul Martin was implementing same-sex marriage, I was working for him in the Prime Minister's office, and at the very beginning of the discussion, public opinion showed that Canadians, the majority of Canadians did not support same-sex marriage in, I think it was around 03, 04. And so the decision was made, well, we can either walk away from this change or we can work. And we will work. We will communicate that this is an issue of human rights. We will remind people of the Charter, and we will spend a long time communicating and working on that message to bring Canadians around, and to everyone's benefit, from the people who built the plan and executed the plan to Canadians themselves who had open minds and reflected and thought, yeah, this is a change we should make. That's another example of taking something that's unpopular and moving ahead and doing it anyway. And so I wonder, and this isn't it's not a question for Alberta in particular, although it is, I think, relevant in terms of the public, in terms of the provincial sales tax question, but governments generally across Canada at every level, are we moving toward all things popular? And should we be looking more at what's right and what can we do that's right to make it popular?
Well, and a question that is attendant to that, I think, is 2019 fundamentally different from any other time in Alberta politics, Canadian politics, Western world politics, whatever. I mean, we seem to think it is, but we might be being chronocentric when we say that. We might be privileging our own time over others. But I agree with you at the same time that could we pass the metric system bill today? And I don't know if we could. I don't know why. I mean, we could dig into that, but we do seem to be living in a different time. And I guess my question is, are we living in a different time fundamentally? And if we are, what are the effects of that?
I don't know, just thinking about the metric system, I want to do this polling question and sort of, find out like how because, here in Canada, we still, all these years later, measure our height in feet and inches and measure our weight in pounds and
cook in Imperial for sure,
and order pints of beer and stuff like that. So we haven't completely embraced the metric system, but we sort of, but we can go to other countries and know how fast to drive our cars, right? But the funny thing is like, when you're talking about same-sex marriage and stuff like that, it's like, it is interesting to watch, attitudes change. I think about, the adoption of seat belts and anti-smoking regulations and things like that. And as a public, we do want governments to lead and not, on important things. The key thing is are you going to lead on an issue that's sort of, fundamental to an election and your re-election or not? And I think, Paul Martin was in a position where that wasn't going to be the ballot question. Same-sex marriage wasn't going to be the ballot question. So he acted on an opportunity to move public opinion along in a way that wouldn't necessarily risk his political fortunes. And so that's the thing, is who can introduce a sales tax in Alberta and do it in some sort of a way that, it won't risk their political fortunes. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we have to have all the politicians go into a closed room and just say, let's all agree on this issue, and the public can just be mad at all of us, and we won't make this a political issue. We will make this an issue. Because I think in a way, gay straight alliances in Alberta, it's kind of what happened. What was it? Was it Bill 13? What was the number? I can't even remember the numbers of bills, but and I'm thinking back to the Jim Prentice days. I'm not thinking back to Jason Kenney's fight on GSAs, where that was so contentious, and then it took a Liberal to introduce a bill, and then everybody sort of agreed, like, let's just pass this, and we'll all agree on this, and we'll all agree to take whatever political flack comes.
It's so interesting, Janet, that you mentioned this idea of politicians going into a room and coming up with an idea that everyone can hate them for, right? And but they know is the right thing to do. It's almost like the compromise that we hope will happen in politics, the better angels of their nature. And all of us in the room, I think, went, yeah, that might work. But I think that's also the genesis of populism. I think many populists feel that when they look at government, that's exactly what's happened. That's precisely what's happened, is that people have gone into a room with big businesses or big corporations or whatever, made these big decisions and said, well, you're just going to have to stuff it because we're going to fight on the other things. We're going to make the other decisions. And populists have said, we want another voice in the arena who will oppose that. Populists on both the left and the right who have said, we haven't been part of the conversation. And before the modern populist movement, I recall, back in the 2000s, there were many people who were saying, free trade is something that we never all agreed on. Why do we just have free trade? It sounds like government is just in bed with big corporations who are making all the money. So the populist argument might get stronger by everyone going into this private room and making a decision that everyone can be mad about. But people like me are like, hey, that might be the only way to do it.
Well, let me just say, I raised that as an idea. I'm not even. I didn't raise it as a workable idea.
Sorry, I didn't mean that. But it's an interesting summation of what populism is fighting against. Denise, you just were nodding there, so I thought I'd pass it over to you.
No, I think it's. I really like the way that you said that, Ben. I think that is. I think it's an important idea. Yeah, I just thought it's beautiful, and that's where I think that it's, and I don't want to talk too much about the GSA debate that happened during the election, but I do think that it warrants discussing, because I was thinking about Janet's comments about trustworthiness, and certainly that is something that everybody who studies politics and measures politics and works in politics knows that trustworthiness is one of the overarching. You want to be able to trust your elected officials. It's just so fundamental to our process and the sustenance of liberal democracy as we know it. And I think that one of the things that I really hope coming out of the last election, because there was that big fight around GSAs, is that those who voted for the NDP, I hope don't think that necessarily everyone who voted for the UCP supported their stance that you should be outing young people at the most vulnerable time in their life.
But come on, in fairness, their stance wasn't you're supposed to be outing people. That's not the UCP stance.
I'm just going to quickly finish.
No, but still, I mean, you got to be responsible here. The NDP stance was not to out gay kids.
For supporters of New Democrats, I think some of them saw a vote for the UCP as a vote for that type of approach to gay-straight alliances. And I hope that what I think happened is simply that it was trustworthiness between each party on different issues. That those who were voting on trustworthiness on social issues were voting for Rachel Notley. Those who were voting for trustworthiness on economic issues were voting for Jason Kenney.
And I'm not saying I agree with Jason Kenney's stance, but I think it's socially responsible to say Jason Kenney's stance was to give teachers the ability to talk to parents if they wanted to. His stance wasn't that kids who join gay-straight alliances should be outed. I just think it's not socially responsible to imply that Jason Kenney's stance was to out gay kids.
Right, but just as earlier you and I think, distinguished between voters perceiving a recession and an actual recession, I'm just commenting on voters perceiving the UCP stance on outing young kids versus what their stance was. And I think that for voters, it's just important to give them that.
With the gay-straight alliances case here, I mean, we're getting into the weeds a little bit, and I want to avoid that.
Totally.
Because let's just, for an example, in 5 years from now, will people know or be talking about what gay-straight alliances are? So what I'm asking is, are they a signal of something deeper?
Yes.
So is the UCP signaling this is where we stand on this issue as a proxy for a ton of other issues, and NDP likewise?
You made that point about populism. The one of the ways of understanding the effects of populism, when politics runs on a left-right dimension, we understand it. We understand what people are promising and what the alternatives are. When it gets onto other dimensions, in federal politics, Quebec, even that's pretty clear. But once you get onto dimensions where the solutions, where the alternative positions and the solutions are not clear, then trust becomes important. And also there's a sort of incoherence. And climate change and the environment is clearly one of those things now. We actually don't know how to do what we said we would with Paris. Nobody actually knows what to do. People will tell you all sorts of things, but in fact, there's nearly nothing you can do to the Canadian economy to meet our Paris targets. So we've most probably blown through those. Mm-hmm. And so when you're trying to, as a politician, think about, well, how do I build trust and get people to believe me? You make promises that you may, as I think the federal Liberals have, were well-intentioned, but were really unmeetable. So you go, and then people say, well, who's telling me the truth on climate change? Well, the answer is actually nobody is. They're doing their best to. I'm not saying they're actually lying, but they actually don't have enough information of what the problem is and how to solve it to actually tell you something that is sort of mechanically true, right? On taxes, they go up or down. I can do things on the economic scale, and everybody knows you'll raise taxes, you'll lower taxes, broadly speaking, you'll do these things. On these other scales, they're incoherent. And when they're incoherent, you get other ways of thinking about politics. People in the room are making decisions together and ignoring us. Right? This is a club. Incoherence leads to things like populism and all these other ways of thinking about politics becoming much more relevant. So I do think that there's a sort of long-term trend. The world economy has become so complex, it's very hard for anybody to tell you what should happen next. The environment is so complex, and we're so short of real information about it, that it's very hard for anybody. So once you start playing on those dimensions, you get a great deal of incoherence and a great deal of opportunity. Or take immigration. If world populations are going to move around, if our borders are not really ours to control, that's a real problem. But it's not a problem with an easy solution, right? So people say, look, what's the solution to the borders? And politicians go, I don't know. Is it an issue? Oh, it's an issue for you. Why? Well, because they imagine this sort of world where people are moving around and we're not in charge of our borders. It increases our level of uncertainty. So things like populists, well, we'll build bigger walls and be nationalists. All those things make more sense when you're facing incoherent and uncertain policy dimensions.
It sounds like the catastrophe of incoherency, if we can call it that, is an opportunity for someone, whether they're a populist or not, to say, I'm the shining light in this gray mess. I'm the one that can be distinct from all of this weird debate, whether it's and also in a managerial debate. A lot of scholars have argued that our democracies have become managerial in nature. So the decisions in an election are about the amount of a tax raise or decrease, as opposed to the actual question of should we have a tax, like a PST. And, someone who comes in and asks the big questions, therefore has a leg up. So for our final minutes, I wanted to ask a final question of each of you, which I often ask on the show at the end, which is, if we had another hour here to talk, what would you want to talk about? What haven't we discussed that you wish we had that's really important for understanding Alberta politics, but also politics at large in the world? Denise, if you've got one off the top of your head.
I think that the big question for me that's obviously getting stoked right now, and I want to know what it means today, is the Western alienation. Being born and raised in Western Canada, I dined on it as a youngster.
Did it taste good?
You know what? I would say that it was very popular in my household. Until what was that Sea-Doo incident when?
Oh, Stockwell Day.
Stockwell Day. That's when my parents got a lot more comfortable with my center left tendencies. But again, it's not a spectrum issue. Western alienation is a federalism issue, and it's one that I do worry about, and I'm interested to see where it goes. Maybe it's just politically convenient for this moment in time. Maybe it's a continuation of a very deep-seated problem with our country, or maybe it's simply regionalism that every region experiences differently, and our name for it is Western alienation. That would be my love if we could keep going.
Mm-hmm. Janet, if we could keep going.
I'd just love to talk about just how diverse Alberta is as a population. I mean, when the election was over, I remember sort of thinking, oh, all my friends in Eastern Canada are going to go, look at those crazy Albertans. They're just a bunch of sort of redneck, right-wing extremists because, we elected the UCP government by such a large margin of victory. But the fact of the matter is the Alberta, I understand, is very complex, very socially progressive, very diverse. And what played out in this election was we were singularly focused on our economic interests and we voted that way. But we are a much more complex society than that. And I don't think a UCP re-election victory is even is a foregone conclusion by any sense. I think we're a complex society, and when we stop focusing on our economic concerns, anything could happen in the next election.
For our democracy, that answer sounds like good news for Alberta.
Yeah, and I sort of, everybody wonders what my political bias is. I'm a pollster. I want it to be close. I want it to be interesting.
You want it to be close. That's a good bias.
And my frustration with this election was I wish it had been a lot more competitive.
Right.
And I hope the next election is a lot more competitive.
Well, I would hope
because it's just funner to poll in a competitive environment.
And I would hope that a conservative or a liberal or an NDP or whoever would agree that a close election or the opportunity for a new government in 4 years, no matter which one, is a good thing. I think that I would hope that anyone would agree that 43 years of PC government that happened in Alberta is just not a good thing for democracy.
This Rachel Notley opposition represents the strongest opposition we've had in Alberta in a generation. It's going to be exciting to watch, Premier Jason Kenney go against Leader of the Opposition, Rachel Notley, because we don't usually have opposition leaders that are so strong. And I think that's going to be really good for Alberta democracy.
So strong, and who once had the mantle of premier too.
That's a rare thing.
And critics that were once ministers. We just don't have a history of this in Alberta, because when we defeat parties, we blow them to smithereens. And the NDP did not get blown to smithereens. There are people going to sit on the opposition bench who will, at least initially, know some of those portfolios better than the ministers do.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, if we had one more thing.
I think as a political scientist, the idea of whether the Alberta party system has dropped into a two-party system, left and right, that would be interesting. And I think the other point about that we've all raised in different ways, that Alberta just happens to be at the centre of a number of dimensions that are becoming increasingly important. How do you balance the environment with the economics? And we've got that peculiar high-carbon industry that's really going to force us to think about that. In Canada, how is federalism going forward? How are we going to make this work? I think it's pretty normal in federal states to have all this disagreement. I like it as long as we're all civil to each other. I'm quite keen on it. You will notice, for example, BC is not very much engaged because you need two parts to it. You need to be engaged and have a disagreement. And of course, British Columbia is relatively disengaged from Canada in all sorts of ways. When you live in British Columbia, I'm amazed the Rocky Mountains are much higher on the British Columbia side because they think of themselves as engaged with Asia and some are doing it. But and I think populism, the fact that there's been populism in Alberta, and that's a growing part of our political discourse. And that goes to the final point about incoherence. If you look at the Greens' result in PEI and now in Vancouver Island, if you look at the difficulties that the federal Liberal government has had, trying to sort of create a coherent strategy, you can see the troubles that all governments all over the world are having at the moment. There is so much deep incoherence to our politics that creating a viable, sustainable, long-term, coherent view of your country, of your economy, is very difficult, and they keep breaking down. You get Trump. That incoherence allows people like Trump to win, allows the Italians to be in the polls. There's a lot of this incoherence, and people are not. It's such a hard job. Justin Trudeau solved the problem by sort of creating these very shiny objects, environmentalism, gender, and a few other things, and the tarnish has come on them partly because the underlying politics is still very difficult, and he's made a few mistakes. So that underlying incoherence, its particular version in Alberta has the, I think, strength of populism and the environment. And so Alberta will be, I think, an interesting case for figuring out how you make the modern world work, how you make politics work across these new and relatively incoherent dimensions.
I just wanted to say that this has been a really interesting conversation, but also a good symbol of what conversation and dialogue can do. And that's not to toot the horn of the podcast or anything. That's to say that for me, one of the most valuable things of doing this project is to engage in dialogue with other people and, of course, to be civil. But, I mean, that to me is automatic. I wouldn't want to ask anyone that because I would assume that we're going to be civil. So I want to even put that to the side. It's not even important, but that because of our different perspectives coming to clash at this table, I think each of us has grown a little bit in this conversation and gained a little bit. I certainly have, and I thank you each for giving us the opportunity of your mind and your time and our dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks for asking.
To learn more about the panel this week, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes and a way to get in touch with me to give me your feedback on this episode or any other. Now, your quote of the week is from Winston Churchill. It goes, "Politics is the ability to foretell what is going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, and then to have the ability afterwards to explain why it didn't happen." Special thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein, and thank you this week to the University of Calgary Department of Political Science for giving us the space in which to record. Next week, we're talking about men and gender equality with author and activist Michael Kaufman. I'll see you then.